Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight we're going to look at timber framed houses. Now if you think about houses in the past, we've made them out of all sorts of things. You could say if you look at prehistoric houses or prehistoric dwellings as such, they were made out of animal skins, woolly mammoth tusks, that sort of thing. And then really wood or timber became the norm. We know, for example, people in the Neolithic and also in the Bronze Age made their homes out of timber. And then later on, the true timber framed house appears really in the Anglo Saxon and in the Middle Ages, and that becomes the norm for a very, very long time. Now, there's two reasons really why we switched to brick. Some people say, well, we switched to brick because it's the new fashion. It's quite simple to make. You get clay, for example, you put it into a former, a wooden mould, you let them dry, and then you kiln fire them, and they make them hard, and then you can build houses out of them. So that's one of the reasons it becomes a new fashion. Let's use brick for a change. Other people actually think brick comes in purely because by the time we talk about really the Georgian period and beyond, the funny thing is, a lot of the trees in Britain are long gone, and that's really down to the fact that we've used them for our Royal Navy to defend our little island that is Britain. But the interesting thing is, we use timber for a very, very long time. Timber framed houses are here for a very long time, and usually when we think of a timber framed building, that's what we think about really. We often give it incorrectly the silly name of the black and white house or the old house. And even now, if you Google on the internet old house, for example, you'll get lots of them. Just up the road in Hereford, for example, there is a building in the middle of their town called the Old House, and it's a bit of a silly name to give them really. I think the worst name to give them is a black and white house, because the funny thing is, it's not really until the Victorian period that they actually paint them black and white as we would see them up and down the country even today. The funny thing is, the woodwork does not need painting because it's oak, and oak will naturally, because of the tannic acid in it, will naturally preserve itself. So technically you're doing more damage painting the wood than you would do leaving it to naturally weather over time. The bits in between, well, yeah, the plastering or the daub, shall we say, was often painted with lime wash, which is a white colour. However, most people actually added all sorts of things to the lime mortar or the lime plaster to give it colour. And we know, for example, they were painted red, green, blue, all sorts of colours really. So when we think of a medieval town, when we think of a Tudor town, what we shouldn't think is it's a landscape painted with black and white houses, because that would be wrong. That's really a Victorian thing. So how were they made? Well, the timber framed house, as the name suggests, was made of a timber framework. And what you would have is the trees would be cut down and the houses were made by the carpenters off site. So it's the equivalent of a flat pack or prefabricated house. You've only got to look at the early Norman castles, they were also prefabricated. So they would cut the timbers down, select the trees they need, cut the timbers down, and square them off. And they would use all sorts of tools for that, like the adze and the axe, obviously. They would then very carefully put joints in them, and they were very carefully cut out, and they would also drill holes in them with hand drills, so they would take a peg. And that's because timber frame buildings are not technically nailed together, they're obviously not glued together, they're actually pegged together with a wooden peg. And I've got an example here of a timber frame work or timber framed joint. So there we have, this is what my dad made me some time ago, so it allows me to explain this with school children. Is you would have all these timbers cut and measured and then socketed like that, and they would also have these holes drilled in, and a large selection of pegs would be required to hold the building together. So it would be made off site, they would get all the framework put together, and that's why it is called a timber framed house. And I always say to children, the framework is very much like the skeleton of our bodies. It gives it the shape, it gives it the strength basically. And then what would happen is the building would then be moved to where it was going to be set up. And believe it or not, a lot of these houses are literally resting on the ground, on the soil. Other ones are actually put on a stone foundation, and we see that in Worcester, for example. If you wander by the Greyfriars down Friar Street, you will see stone footings, a very shallow set of foundations as such, and then you will see the timber work resting literally on top of that. And naturally the wood will bow and bend to find its natural level, and that's why timber frame buildings are very noticeably not straight, and that really does go to show when you compare it with a mock Tudor building from the 19th or even 20th century. Now, so they know how to put each bit back together, because remember they are flat packed, they usually put carpenter's marks on them. Now the carpenter's marks would have, for example, the maker's mark specifically, but it would also in a way tell you where part A sits to part B. And then what they would do is obviously peg it all together. So these pegs would be hammered in, and usually they're not sawn off. Usually they're sticking out quite a long way, and that's quite useful within the house because it's useful for hanging things on. So that's your framework, that's your timber framework put together. And then what they would do is add in the walls, bearing in mind they would have also marked out where the windows and doors were going to be, because obviously they would be left open. And what they would do is use a style of building known as wattle, and wattle is nothing more than woven twigs, usually hazel or willow, and you would have these uprights hammered into the timbers, and they would be socketed in really tight, and then someone will weave the woodwork in and out, and then over out, over in. So you're alternating it. That makes it extremely strong. The only problem is you will still get the wind blowing through. And I always say the wattle is the equivalent of having muscle and ligaments within the skeleton of the human, and it really gives it extra strength and literally holds the thing together. Now there is an interesting legal term which is often referred to as breaking and entering, and that actually comes from the wattle, and that's down to the fact that most people knew it was more difficult to break into a house through a window or through a door, and they would usually go round the back of the property where they probably won't be seen, and they would literally smash through the wattle. And that's why you have the term today for breaking in as breaking and entering. You're breaking through the wattle. It's a term that's still used in courts even to this day. So we've got the timber frame, we've now got the walls made of the wattle, and to give it a bit more privacy and to keep the wind and the weather out, they would then daub it. And daub is an interesting substance, is the best way of putting it. This is a small selection of the ingredients that make up daub, and daub is made of obviously mud to start with. They would gather together, shovel together a huge amount of earth, soil, mud. They would then mix it with clay, which I would have got from deeper in the ground, something that's sticky and will harden in the air, in the sunlight. They would also mix into that straw and horsehair. That binds it all together. And a little secret ingredient which children absolutely love is cow manure. And cow manure, if you look at it and study it, has a lot of grass fibres in, so it acts in the same way as horsehair and straw. And what they would do is mix it together, usually by taking their shoes off, and they would stamp in it to churn it all up together, mixing it together. And then to apply the daub, it's not literally slapped onto the wattle, you have to throw it on. So you would make these snowballs and you would launch it at the wattle, and by doing that it actually sticks better because it actually smears itself through the woodwork, through the daub, through the wattle I should say, and it when it dries it holds on. If you literally slapped it on and then it dried out, it would literally fall off. So it's quite an important thing to actually throw it on. The final layer was usually a thin skim of daub, or sometimes even a lime plaster. It depends on how much money you've got, really. Now, what about the gaps? Well, obviously where the doors are, you would make a timber door, a very strong timber door, usually with a thumb latch attached to it and bolts on the inside. We also know some had padlocks on, so people could be literally locked in at night to prevent anyone breaking in. And then where the openings were, they were usually left open, and a wooden shutter was placed across the hole. And then what people would do, if the weather was good or in the summertime, they would every morning open the shutter, and that's pretty much all people had. Or you could use cow's horn. As I mentioned before, cow's horn can be laid into a frame to allow light in, but not to allow the weather to come in. For those of the upper classes that would probably have more than one story, they could even have glass put in. And obviously this consisted of small panes of glass held together by lead beadwork to hold it all in, which is a very expensive thing. Very few houses actually had glass, especially in the Middle Ages, but up to the 17th century glass was an extremely expensive thing to have. On the roof, however, you had a choice. Now, some people would use what's called a shingle, and a shingle, we have one here, is nothing more than a plank, a shaped plank of wood. You can see it's narrow at the one end, and they would be overlapping, and that would keep the rain off the roofs. The alternative to that was tiling. So there we have a clay tile that would have been produced locally and then put up on the roof. Some people use stone. I do actually have a stone roof slate as such, or slates. It depends really on where you are in the country, depending on the material that was being used. But most people often think, well, as it's a timber framed house, it would have to have straw or even reed thatching. But the funny thing is, even though that was quite a rural thing, especially in some parts of the country, for people in Worcester specifically, by the 15th century, we had banned that. So actually, the homes in Worcester, within the city wall, would have actually been made of tiles or even stone slates upon the roof, really. And that would have been really useful because it prevented fires, because Worcester, especially in the 11th and 12th century, had seen quite a few fires. But that is how the houses were, really, timber framed. Now, as I mentioned, the framework, that would have been left to go a grey colour. The natural tanning acid within the oak would go a natural grey colour. And the gaps in between, that's now all daubed over, that is pretty much like your skin, if you're comparing it with the other things that I've mentioned, could actually be painted any colour that you wanted, like I said. And if you go down Friar Street in Worcester again, ignore the Victorian black and white ones. But if, for example, you look at Mackin Jacks, I think it's called, that's red in colour. There's a couple of other houses down there, green in colour, and that's actually how it should be. Timber frame buildings should be quite colourful. Now, if I draw your attention to the visit of Elizabeth I in 1575, famously, the corporation of the city, the aldermen, the elders of the city, the council is such today, actually announced that Worcester houses must be painted for the visit of Elizabeth I, and they stated there they should be painted in comely colours. In other words, bright colours. So hopefully that's given you a little insight to timber frame buildings, how they're put together really. And what you'll also notice, you show off your wealth literally by having as many floors as you can get in. In the Middle Ages, 2-storey maximum really, most places. By the 17th century, just like the one in Worcester called Nash's House, you can have 3 or 4 stories high. And the interesting thing is, you wouldn't get wet when it rained like it has done today, because if you walk in the street below the jetty, the bit that sticks out, you will be pretty safe from not only the toilets being emptied out, but also from the bad weather. The jetty, by the way, does actually give you an extra bit of space, because famously you pay your rent on the floor space only. Anyway, on that note, stay safe. Have an interesting and enjoyable week. Remember, we're doing a vast amount of walks this week, so if you want to join us, we're doing at least 3 a day, usually 2, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and then obviously our daily 6 o'clock tour. Please remember, you do have to book in advance. Please don't turn up. Because of the restrictions with COVID-19, you have to book in advance. So please let us know if you want to come on those. Anyway, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.